Did you know that the legendary Lada Niva had a lesser-known successor? And not just any successor, but a result of a joint venture between the Russian car maker Lada and the American giant General Motors. In this video, I'll dive into the story of how the successor to the classic Niva came to be, why it was sold under the Chevrolet Niva brand, and what ultimately happened to this unique collaboration.
Before we begin, a quick note. As you can probably tell, my English isn't perfect yet, so I use AI for voiceover. But everything else, the ideas, the script, the research, and editing, I do myself. So if you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's dive into today's topic.
By the 1980s, the classic Niva had not yet become outdated. However, Avtovaz, the official name of the company, recognized that the Niva had limited potential for modernization. Therefore, a decision was made to develop an entirely new model, a successor to the Niva. This project was assigned the Index 2123, with 1986 marking its official inception when the technical specifications were finalized and dispatched to Avtovaz's design departments. A notable feature of the 2123's technical specifications was the proposed frame body design. This construction, featuring plastic body panels mounted on a frame, had both proponents and opponents within the company at the time. Globally, vehicles like the Renault Espace had already been produced using this approach. However, this idea was soon abandoned due to the significant financial investment and complete production overhaul it would require. Mass producing a vehicle with a frame body demanded new technologies and materials. The structural framework would need to incorporate high alloy steels, and the outer panels would require expensive and complex plastics. Consequently, despite the apparent advantages of a plastic frame panel construction, its mass production was deemed impractical at the time. Among the designers, opinions about the concept of the future vehicle were almost evenly split. Some believed that the new car could sacrifice off-road capability in favor of other consumer qualities. Others argued that the new Niva should not fall short of the classic model in terms of off-road potential. And since the original Niva had proven itself brilliantly in that regard, the factory leadership didn't dare abandon its main advantage. Once it was firmly decided that the new Niva would conceptually be a refined continuation of its predecessor's off-road legacy, the designers moved on to shaping the body design. Initially, two-scale models were created. Chemushkin's version closely resembled a modernized classic Niva and was clearly based on the old platform. In contrast, the sketches by another designer, Belyakov, presented a very different vision of the future Niva. Five-door, more streamlined and rounded, with narrow front headlights and an aerodynamic silhouette. It was not tied to the old platform and, frankly, for 1986, looked quite impressive. However, despite its forward-thinking nature, Belyakov's design was rejected by the factory leadership. And here's an interesting detail. I'm not implying anything. Draw your own conclusions. Another version of the new Niva's exterior design belonged to Vaz designer Stepanov. However, this concept also didn't make the cut and never progressed beyond the sketch stage. By 1989, the plant's technical council had reviewed and officially approved the concept for the new Niva. Thus, after 5 years of searching and experimentation, the final decision was made. It would be a five-door vehicle with a longitudinally mounted engine and permanent all-wheel drive, following the classic Niva layout, through a center differential with a locking function. Unfortunately, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 had a major impact on the project, which was unofficially downgraded in priority. All efforts at the factory were redirected toward launching a new passenger car, while the Niva's production was postponed indefinitely. There were also problems with the styling. The earlier design concepts looked too much like conventional passenger cars, and didn't quite align with the SUV-like concept of the vehicle. Moreover, by the early 1990s, the prototype's exterior design appeared more like today than tomorrow. It was clear that by the time the car reached production, it would already look outdated. The designers at the factory understood this and tried to find another timeless design, just as they had once achieved with the original Niva. By 1993, designer Sayomushkin returned with a new take on the Niva's look, now as a five-door version in the trending bio-design style of the era. One interesting detail: Sayomushkin was strongly against placing the spare tire on the rear door, even though many of his colleagues insisted on it. He believed the original placement of the spare tire under the hood of the classic Niva was an elegant engineering solution, as he put it. That's why they initially tried to mount the spare tire under the trunk floor. However, due to packaging constraints, the fifth wheel was eventually mounted in the typical SUV fashion, on the tailgate. By 1995, the first running prototypes of the new Niva were finally ready. Tests showed that the vehicle was more stable, spacious, and comfortable than the original, but when it came to off-road capabilities, it clearly fell short of the classic Niva. At the same time, Avtovaz engineers continued refining the design. One particular styling detail that drew criticism from factory leadership was the front grille design, which was humorously nicknamed Dnepro GES on the front by plant workers, referring to its large number of vertical slots and a distinct curve. In the revised version, the grille kept the ventilation openings, but the curve was removed to give it a cleaner look. However, full-scale production still hadn't started. Between 1999 and 2001, only about 1,000 units of the new Niva were built as part of a limited pilot industrial run. In 2001, General Motors and Avtovaz established a joint venture named GM Avtovaz. The American corporation showed interest in the new Niva and decided to create a joint venture specifically for its production. Production of the new SUVs was set up at the Lada West Togliatti subsidiary. Additionally, the Americans insisted on producing the SUV under the Chevrolet brand. From then on, the Lada Niva became the Chevrolet Niva, while the classic Niva was referred to as the Lada 4x4. Thus, through certain maneuvers, the plant lost its creation. As per the contract, the new SUV could only be produced at the joint venture and only as the Chevrolet Niva. However, in the eyes of consumers, the Chevrolet Niva was not associated with the American brand. It was still the same Lada, but with a cross on the hood. Moreover, 19 out of 20 Russians had no idea why their Niva was produced under the Chevrolet brand. The nickname Shniva became popular among the people. As for the classic Niva, it continued to be called Niva, and the 4x4 designation didn't stick, not even among dealers. Another curious point is that GM limited the export of the new Niva only to nearby countries like Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. For some reason, exports to European and Asian countries were not carried out. Meanwhile, the classic Niva, which continued to be produced at the main Avtovaz plant, was exported worldwide, from Europe to Asia and Latin America. At home, the new Niva didn't achieve the same fame as the classic, and didn't become a legend during its lifetime. However, it firmly occupied its niche. In 2002, the base Chevrolet Niva was priced at $8,000, and essentially, its competitors were only used cars, while the new classic Niva was even cheaper. The engines and all the technical components of the Shniva were from Lada, a 1.7-liter engine, a manual transmission, and a transfer case from the classic Niva. In other words, the aggregate base was time-tested and highly repairable. The first restyling of the Niva occurred in 2009, with the design development entrusted to the design studio Steel Bertone. Their task was to refresh the model in the style of GM vehicles. The car received projector headlights, a different lighting design, and, importantly, some modifications retained the unpainted plastic body kit, because there's been a long-standing trend to paint bumpers in the body color. Even on vehicles positioned as SUVs, painting bumpers on an SUV is quite a strange decision, while unpainted plastic looks better and is cheaper, in my opinion. In 2020, Avtovaz bought GM's stake in the joint venture, thereby regaining the rights to the Niva brand. From 2020, the Chevrolet Niva became the Lada Niva again, and the classic Niva, instead of the faceless 4x4, received the name Niva Legend. In 2021, another restyling was carried out, and the new name Lada Niva Travel was assigned. This restyling was done independently and, in my opinion, wasn't the most successful. No, it's not terrible, but Avtovaz has a great example in the classic Niva. The example is that it's better not to make radical redesigns to an old car. The Lada Niva Travel is still in production today, with its price on the Russian market starting from $14,600 for the base configuration. I wouldn't say it's cheap, although for a full-fledged SUV, this might be an acceptable price. The Niva Legend starts from $11,300 in the base configuration. Yes, despite the fact that the new Niva was developed as the successor to the classic, they are still produced in parallel on the same assembly line. My family also had a Chevrolet Niva. My father bought it used in a very rare color for it, light green. Unfortunately, no photos or videos of it have been preserved. And you know what I want to tell you? My first impression when I sat in its cabin, it was very comfortable and cozy. It had minimal options, not the most powerful and torquey engine, but the seating and the feeling inside were somehow homely and cozy. At that time, my father had two cars, a Ford Mondeo M2 and a Chevrolet Niva. The Niva was bought as a second car. The main one was the Ford. But when it came time to keep only one car, they sold the Ford and kept the Niva. This video is coming to an end. Write your opinions about this unusual American-Russian car in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new videos. See you next time.